Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be discussing President Trump's recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and asking what does that mean and why is this so important? Warm welcome to the programme, and my guest today is a good friend and a good friend on the Middle East Report, Robin Benson. And Robin, it's great to have you back on the programme, particularly over your heart attack that you had over the Christmas period. So great to know that you're well. Would you just share a little bit with our viewers, because you are very popular with our viewers, and many of our viewers were very, very concerned over the Christmas period.
Well, just first of all to say thank you for the opportunity to come back in the programme.
Always welcome.
But also thank you to the viewers who prayed for me over the last sort of 2 to 3 months. Yeah, it's been a bit of a rough winter with the heart attack on Boxing Day evening, but you know, God carried me through all of that 3.5 hours from the moment I had the heart attack to being whisked into the hospital in Brighton, straight into the theatre, ended up having put a stent put into my heart. And, you know, 3.5 hours later, I was up on the recovery ward. So, you know, but there was a real sense of peace and calm. I knew people were praying for me, you know, from the moment it happened until I got back up into the ward. And so then the recovery period started. And then at the end of February, I picked up a chest bug of some sort that morphed into pneumonia. So that sort of set me back a bit, but things are much better now. And I, you know, feel more or less back to normal, whatever normal is. But it's good to be here today.
Excellent. And thank you. You can discuss this very important issue of the Golan Heights and the fact that President Trump has, on the 25th of March, recognised Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which no other US president has done, nor has any other nation done. What is so significant about President Trump's decision to recognise Israeli sovereignty over the strategic plateau known as the Golan Heights?
Well, I think probably from Israel's perspective more than anything else, it just helps them realize that there are those out there in the world who are politically behind the important measures that they need to take for their own protection. And I'm sure, you know, we'll discuss this as this program goes on, but the Golan Heights, you and I have both visited there, you know, probably on several occasions, and we know literally from the geography how vitally strategic it is for Israel's security up in that sort of northeast corner of the land. Because you've got 3 nations that are antagonistic towards Israel butting up onto the border, and you know, with all the mess that there is in Syria, the history of Israel's holding onto that piece of land and the need to do that, looking at the prior history, only proves the necessity of Israel having that strip of land for its own protection.
Absolutely. Yeah, you did mention, I've been to the Golan quite a few times, and it's the Hula Valley and the Golan Heights have got to be my favourite part of Israel. Not only is it extremely beautiful up there because you have the wonderful kind of vineyards up there as well as some of the great places that you can actually visit. But as you said, it's so strategically important because it borders both Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. The fact is that Israel control that plateau, including Mount Hermon, with listening devices up on Mount Hermon. Particularly with the destabilization of the Middle East happening in Lebanon and in Syria and throughout the Middle East, is kind of vital that Israel maintain its sovereignty and control of the Golan Heights. But in light of everything that's going on with the Syrian civil war and the fact that the Iranians have something like 80,000 troops and militias, less than 50 miles away from Israel's border on the Golan Heights, really makes it the indication why President Trump has decided to recognise Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So why has he decided to do this, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think politically it was a useful move and reinforced Prime Minister Netanyahu's the strong relationship that he, as the Prime Minister of Israel, has with the current administration in the United States, at a time when obviously the whole election process was going on in Israel. So it would have been a feather in Bibi's cap. Let's be honest about it. That's the case. But it's also the fact that the world's superpower has indicated that the reality on the ground is such that Israel has the right to have this land for its own self-protection. I mean, there are those who debate, how that all came about, and we'll maybe discuss that. But it's just the fact that the world's superpower is behind Israel and is bolstering what has been, the boots on the ground reality for nearly, 30, 40, over 40 years, nearly 50 years.
Absolutely. So let's give you some facts about the Golan Heights. Firstly, the Golan Heights is territory in Israel's eastern corner on the Syrian border. It is rural, mountainous, and mostly empty. There are fewer than 50,000 people who live there, less than 1% of Israel's population out of 8.7 million. Half of the Golan's residents are Jewish Israelis who live mostly in small agricultural communities, but the other half are from a religious group called the Druze, and they are mostly former citizens of Syria. So let's have a look at this excellent news report that mentions President Trump's recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan.
The Golan Heights is a relatively small area of the Middle East that intersects Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. The Sea of Galilee and various rivers offer a natural, if not disputed, border. It's named after a biblical passage from the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, and covers a bean-shaped area roughly 71 kilometers from north to south and 43 kilometers east to west at its widest. Nations have wrestled for supremacy over the ancient land for more than a century. In modern times, Jews began settlement attempts around 1894, but were thwarted by a hostile Arab population and Ottoman law. The French inherited the Golan as part of their Mandate of Syria after the First World War, and independent Syria took over in 1941. 7 years later, another conflict left many dead while Syria fortified its western border. Israel eventually gained control through occupation of the territory during the Six-Day War in June 1967. That's a period of time that saw Israel triple in size while it fought with Arab neighbors Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. Settlements soon followed, and Israel effectively annexed the Golan in 1981. Syria tried to reclaim the land in force during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War that eventually proved unsuccessful. On the 25th of March 2019, U.S. President Donald Trump signed a proclamation officially granting U.S. recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu looked on. So far, the U.S. is the only country to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan. Both Canada and the United Nations refused to follow suit. John Haddon, Global News. For more news, sports, and weather, please visit globalnews.ca.
And that was a good analysis produced there by Global News. Robin, now, when we look at the history of the Golan Heights, it was initially designed to be part of the British mandate, but there was discussions, and so therefore they decided to give this as part of the French mandate, in which after the end of the First World War, when the British and the Anzac forces had defeated the Ottoman Empire, it fell into British hands, and it was given by the League of Nations to Britain and France to prepare those nations for statehood. The French got Lebanon, and they also got Syria as well, and therefore the Golan Heights became part of the French mandate. Now, we know that ever since the end of World War II in particular, when Syria gained her independence, we know that Syria took part in Israel's first war of independence when the the Arab nations tried to destroy Israel at her birth over 70 years ago. And we've seen incredible hostility from the Syrian regime, really ever since kind of 1949 onwards until 1967, with many of the Syrian regime firing rockets and missiles into Israel prior to the Six-Day War that targeted the kibbutzim in the Galilee. Can you just talk us through a little bit, if you were an Israeli living in the Galilee prior to the Six-Day War in June 67 and having to face these rockets and missiles that are fired from the Golan Heights into Israel proper, what life would have been like at that time?
Well, life for those communities around the shores of the Lake Galilee would have been as we understand life is on the border of Gaza today. Except in those days, there wouldn't have been bomb shelters. They wouldn't have been built into people's homes. They wouldn't have been even provided, by the local municipality. So you literally were taking your life in your hands, going about any sort of daily, whether it was agricultural life up on the kibbutzim, just going about your normal life, literally on a day-to-day basis, because you never knew when the Syrians were going to lob a missile or shoot a long-range projectile from up on the top of the Golan Heights. And this was going on from the end of the Israeli War of Independence. And this is the sort of situation that anybody in that area around the north and the eastern shore of the Galilee and the hills that sort of sweep up from it had to live with. And I mean, probably some of the viewers who are watching this program are old enough, I mean, I'm not, but are old enough to remember, the air raids during World War II, or their parents are old enough and have talked about it. Here in the UK, this is what Jewish people living in those communities had to live with day in, day out for many years before Israel took the land back.
And also, it's very important to acknowledge the incredible antagonism caused by the Syrian regime prior to the Six-Day War, particularly in trying to divert the headwaters of the River Jordan away from Israeli territory, which would have been absolutely terrible for the Israelis living there prior to the Six-Day War. And this was a major factor of why Israel deemed it necessary to actually conquer the Golan Heights in June 67.
Yes, we don't realise, again, because we don't think about the geography in conflicts often. But yes, the water sources feeding into the Galilee are coming off the Golan. All of that area is feeding into the Galilee, which is actually still Israel's largest freshwater source for the whole of the country. And so, even more so then as all of that infrastructure was being set up. So the threat of water being diverted away from Lake Galilee was a major issue, again, we talked about the agricultural communities. They need the irrigation, they need the water in order to provide the food for the other people, in the nation that they're providing for. And yes, Syria was one of the worst of the Arab nations that attacked Israel and kept attacking Israel on an intermittent basis from the Golan.
Absolutely. And then during the Six-Day War of June 1967, we know that the Syrian regime's forces actually surrendered to that of the Egyptian forces under President Nasser. And so therefore there was a joint initiative on behalf of the Egyptians together with the Syrians to invade Israel in 67. And it was because of Israel's incredible airstrikes against the Egyptian Air Force and the Jordanian and also Syrian Air Force together with that of the Iraqi Air Force that gave Israel air superiority and supremacy in that war, that Israel then turned her attention to the problem up in the Golan Heights. Now, it was an incredible feat to actually then take the Golan Heights with that mountain ridge. Share something about what you think the incredible bravery and the courage of the Israeli soldiers to actually climb that huge plateau known as the Golan Heights and actually take that from the Syrians.
Well, again, if you've visited, if you've had the blessing of being able to go to Israel on a tour and have spent a few days up in the Galilee region, you will know how steep the inclines were. So these young men and women who are defending the nation they are out in the open attacking positions that are in a superior place, firing down upon them. There were many lives lost in taking the Golan, in capturing it. But Israel knew for its security and its safety how desperately important it was to deal with the continuous Syrian attacks, and therefore they were prepared to basically pay any cost in order to ensure that that was the case.
Absolutely, and this is also part of Israel's security arrangements to actually protect themselves from the Syrian regime's constant military offensive against the newly formed Jewish state, and to actually protect itself strategically. And of course, having control of the Golan Heights meant that Israel could protect itself from any future invasion from Syria or from Lebanon, and actually then protect the communities in the Galilee, was it?
And we know the situation that after the 60s, the 67, the 68 war, Israel was willing to enter into negotiation, peace negotiations.
Absolutely.
And they did with Egypt and gave back to Sinai and so on. And they were willing to enter into negotiations with Syria. But the Syrian regime has adamantly all the time refused to negotiate. So again, I think what President Trump has, when he recognized Israeli sovereignty, actually recognized the intransigence of the Syrian regime for 40, 50 years, refusing to negotiate, and it's basically, okay, you guys have refused all of this time to negotiate.
Absolutely.
The reality on the ground is that Israel is there. We're going to recognize that. That's it. The old expression, like it or lump it, Yeah.
Part of my first trip to Israel, Robin, was back in the summer of 1996 with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and part of our course when I was studying modern Hebrew and on the kibbutz, a beautiful kibbutz called Ein HaShefet in the Carmel. We then had a weekend trip up to the Golan Heights, and the tour guides took us to quite a spectacular place called Gamala. And Gamla is this ancient Jewish city up in the Golan Heights that stood with Jerusalem in the revolt against Rome. And she paid a very heavy price because the Romans destroyed the city of Gamla in AD 67. Now, what was so extraordinary was that once the Golan Heights became back in Israeli territory, that the archaeologists found this ancient city known as the city of Gamla that looks like a kind of camel's back, which really did show the identification with ancient Israel with modern Israel. And it was exactly 2,000 years since the destruction of Gamla to Gamla going back into Israeli hands. How prophetic and spiritually significant do you think that archaeological find was back in 67?
Well, I think in many ways Gamla has been treated as the poor relation to Masada. Everybody tries to go to Masada, but they actually call Gamla the Masada of the North.
Yes.
Because it held out for so long, and then the Romans got in, and there are various interpretations by the archaeologists as to what happened. There certainly was mass slaughter on the part of the Romans, but there's also some historical evidence that, as with Masada, some of the remaining inhabitants refused to kowtow to the Romans and actually jumped off a cliff edge. Now, whether they were forced to do that by the Romans or whether they did it voluntarily, nobody actually knows. But several thousand lost their lives by literally going over a cliff face rather than surrender themselves to the Romans. And it's only in the last, 5, 10, 15, 20 years that Israel has begun to recognize the importance of Gamla's role in that rebellion against the Romans. Has created a historical park in the area where tourists can now go, and the story of Gamla can be unfolded, and people learn, again, the self-sacrifice of the Jewish people in order to try and protect their own nation.
Absolutely. And also the Golan Heights played another major part in probably Israel's most bloodiest battle in her history, the Yom Kippur War, in which in October 1973, Israel faced a joint attack from the Egyptian and Syrian forces simultaneously on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, known as Yom Kippur. And the situation up in the Golan was looking bleak. I think Israel had only the presence of a very small number of tanks in comparison to about 1,500 Syrian tanks had been really supplied by the Soviets, and it was looking pretty desperate. How important do you think Israel having a presence on the Golan Heights was in order to protect Israel from invasion by the Syrian forces that would actually invade from the Golan straight into the Galilee?
I think you're going to show part of a clip, in a little while in the program. That is it's a miraculous story. I mean, it just makes the hair in the back of my neck stand on end every time I see it. But again, it's reinforcing the reality that without the protection of Israel owning the Golan Heights, Syria has free rein to do whatever it likes, or would have without Israel being there, to invade, to shell, to bomb, to kill Jewish citizens and Druze citizens, of that part of the country. It is crucial to Israel to hold on to that because of the intense vitriolic hatred that the Syrian regime has towards the Jewish state.
So let's have a look now at this kind of inspirational video, and this one's entitled The Yom Kippur War Miracle, in which the Israeli forces found themselves against all odds and had an incredible angelic encounter.
The Syrian front opened on a disastrous turnover. Emek HaBacha, the Valley of Tears. Avigdor Kahalani, the Tzvika unit. The Syrians advanced to the mountain line of the Golan Heights, the Bnot Yaakov Bridge. There they stopped. Why did they stop? Why didn't they continue their attack? The Syrian soldiers have taken along civilian clothes. The Syrians had promised that, God forbid, they would invade the land and take our daughters. Syrian officers told them to take civilian clothes along with them and invade Jaffa, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Tiberias. But a miracle happened. They stopped in the mountain line of the Golan Heights. Avigdor Kahalani said, I was alone, only 3 tanks, and I stopped 150 Syrian tanks. The War of the Judgment Day, a time when a person is at one with his Creator, a time when God says to his sons, Dear sons, I want to redeem you, a time when they stood in synagogues and yeshivas praying the afternoon prayer, a time of the priestly blessing, for your thoughts are not my thoughts. The Egyptians thought if they attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, they would be victorious. But the complete opposite happened. On Yom Kippur, we were on high alert. Everyone was in the synagogues. War, war shouts in the synagogues. Did we thank our Lord? We began to give thanks. The nation of Israel began to realize their great mistake, and many began to repent and return to their heritage. Or Chaim, Or Sameach, Mechon Ma'ir, yeshivas, for those who returned to their heritage. People began to open their eyes and recognize the holy name of God in the War of the Judgment Day. But the question remains to this very day. How could it be possible that the Syrians were stopped on a mountain line of the Golan Heights? The answer was recorded during an investigation session conducted by the Secret Service while interviewing an officer of the Syrian 9 Division. Why did you stop on the line in the Golan Heights? The officer answers, I'd like to see you cross that Syrian line after seeing a long row of white angels standing on the line and a white hand descending from the heavens motioning to you. Stop, I stopped. Israeli soldiers who saw the Syrians standing in a row as if one tank had scared off an entire division of the Syrian tanks didn't know the answer.
And that's one of those incredible stories that's taken place in Israel's history, where we've literally seen the angelic protection of the nation of Israel, particularly at times of war and times of real crisis. What was so extraordinary about this case is there was only, I think, 3 Israeli tanks going up against 150 Syrian tanks, and they were only 5 minutes from actually crossing the border into crossing the Jordan River into the Galilee with devastating consequences for Israel. So isn't this a reminder of how powerful it is when we pray for the peace of Jerusalem? Exactly,
Simon. And it just reinforces the part that believers in Jesus can play in, assisting the Lord in protecting his people. I mean, again, we don't realize how narrow Israel is. down that coastal strip. And so if the Syrians had gotten over the Golan and into the Galilee, as this guy says, Tel Aviv, Jaffa, all these major port cities down the Mediterranean coast would have been open to attack, because there would have been nothing to stop them, because the Israeli forces were still mobilizing, at this point, because they'd been caught on the hop, because most folk were in the synagogues for Yom Kippur. And so stories like this that I think come from this documentary Against All Odds, over and over and over again reinforce God's intervention to protect his people, to protect his land. And we need to take that on board and then work with him as believers to see that something like that never happens again.
It's quite incredible. And also what's so incredible, going back to the whole story of Gamla, is that when the archaeologists started discovering the Golan Heights after it fell back into Israeli hands, they found a number of ancient Jewish settlements with the menorah on it, which indicates that there was a Jewish presence in the land. And also, listening to a recent Israeli tour guide up on the Golan, have actually come out and said that the Israelis, scientists and agriculturalists, used the Bible to understand what plants and what vegetation grew up on the Golan Heights, so they could do the same. And the fact is now that Israel's famous winery is based up in the Golan Heights, and so much of Israel's rich agricultural land is up there, which indicates how significant really the Golan is.
I mean, it is very lush, it's very beautiful, it's very rocky as well. I mean, there's granite and basalt all over the place, but there's such a contrast between the south and the north in the country. You've got the desert, the Negev down in the south, which at certain times of the year goes a little bit green when there's some rain, but for most of the year it's just brown, barren. And then you gradually, as you work your way up the country, it just turns more and more green until you get up into the Galilee and the Golan area, and it is just beautiful, glorious place to visit.
Absolutely. And on the issue of the Golan, it wasn't until 1981 when Israel's Prime Minister then, Menachem Begin, decided to annex the land in 81 as an indication to Syria and the enemies of Israel that Israel is not conceding this very important strategic real estate. How important was that decision back in 1981 by Menachem Begin to actually recognise Israeli sovereignty and therefore enforce Israeli law in the Golan?
Well, I think, like any Israeli premier, any Israeli government, taking that sort of decision, you take a risk. But I'm sure Menachem Begin and his administration felt it was a risk that was worth taking, because so much time had passed and the Syrians had proven totally intransigent in coming forward to sit down and negotiate peace. You had the Arab League meeting in, was it Khartoum? With the three no's. No recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. What was the third one?
No peace with Israel.
No peace with Israel. And the Syrians and all the others bought into that. So if you have a situation like that, what are you left with other than to ensure that the security of your nation is set in place, and then seek to get on with fostering the development or the redevelopment and the repopulation and the expansion and making the most of what the Golan and the Galilee have to offer for the rest of the country?
Which is very important. And sadly, nations like our nation, like Britain and the EU, still to this day fail to see the strategic importance of the Golan Heights to Israel, and that in any peace treaty that Israel were to make with the Syrian regime, and now with the civil war, makes that absolutely impossible. The heavy price that Israel would have to pay in terms of security and protection of her communities in the Galilee, and also not only that, but also Israel's water supplies up there, as well as the kind of the agriculture, have to give up in terms of making a peace treaty with a kind of Syrian regime.
Well, I mean, in theory, if it was just the Syrian regime, you could, with a big question mark, say maybe there's a possibility of negotiating some sort of peace treaty. But now that you've got the Iranian regime thoroughly embedded and supporting Bashar al-Assad and his government, and as you said in the introduction, you've got Iranian militias and full-blown forces within 50 miles of, and 50 miles is not a long way, from a border area. You can look and see 50 miles in a decent set of binoculars. So if you've got the Iranian regime who week in, literally week out, make statements about annihilating the Jewish people and destroying the state of Israel on Israel's eastern border in Syria, the whole concept of a negotiated peace just went out the window. It doesn't exist. And the fact that our politicians, our diplomats, and the European Union's politicians and diplomats cannot seem to grasp the reality, literally, of what's on the ground just beggars belief. And, we were talking about this before we, went on air. It's like they don't believe the rhetoric that comes out of the mouths of these guys. Israel cannot afford not to believe it, because it's literally life and death for people and for the state to ignore it.
Absolutely. And the closest that Israel came to having a peace treaty with the Syrian regime of President Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, was back in the kind of mid-90s after, for example, the Clinton administration. President Clinton had already negotiated a peace treaty between Israel and the PLO, known as the Oslo Accords, back in 93. And then in 1995, we had the Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement with King Hussein of Jordan. And then he turned his attention to the Golan Heights. Now, what made negotiations so difficult between the Israelis and the Syrians was the fact that President Clinton was reported to lie about the position to both sides, which almost caused a war in the summer of 1996 with some false intelligence reports that led something like 40,000 Syrian troops to mass on the border of Israel on the Golan Heights, and Israel came that close, within a whisker, of going to a major war with Syria over the Golan Heights, based on false intelligence and based on miscommunication and lies from the Clinton administration. So that really does show how precarious this has been, and in foresight that Israel's been under huge pressure to make a peace treaty with Syria, and from 1973 right through to 2011, Israel's border with Syria was the most stable and safest border. But now we've seen that deteriorate, and now in hindsight it seems like a very, very good move that Israel didn't concede the Golan Heights for a possible peace treaty with Syria, because today it wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on.
Yeah, I mean, it's verging on national, I don't know, I was going to say national suicide to consider it under the present circumstances, because there is just no indication on the part of the Bashar al-Assad regime, bolstered as it is by Iran, and you have to bring Russia into the mix as well, because they're involved in it as well. There's just no sense of wanting to sit down and discuss the possibility of ending hostilities. It doesn't exist.
So let's have a look at this report produced by the Israeli Government Press Office, where Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is meeting America's ambassador to the United States, Mr. Friedman, together with US Senator Lindsey, to discuss how important strategic the Golan Heights is to Israel.
Two of the greatest friends of Israel, and they're also my personal friends, Senator Lindsey Graham and Ambassador David Friedman. Senator, this is not your first time in the Golan Heights, but I think every time you come here, you can appreciate the strategic importance of Israel being on the Golan Heights, and the fact that we're creating here new life, green life, a future, which is very different, obviously, from what existed before. I think the most important observation that I'd make is that the Golan has always been part of Israel from the earliest days of our history, and has certainly been the part of the State of Israel since 1967 and more recently since 1981. The Golan is part of Israel. The Golan must stay part of Israel forever. And I think it's very important that the international community recognize this fact and accept it, and most especially our great friend, the United States of America. I want to thank you for your unbelievable support. I don't think the citizens of Israel know everything that I know about the work you've done over successive administrations. We have no greater friend, and we appreciate it. So thank you, friend, and welcome, friend.
Thank you very much. From the state of South Carolina. I come here as an American. I come here to try to figure out what's best for America. What's best for America is for a safe, secure, and prosperous Israel. Why? Common values, common enemies, and from a military point of view, the best friend the United States could possibly ever have in a troubled region. I cannot tell you how much intelligence is given to the United States from our friends in Israel that protect the American homeland. So if you believe as I do, the state of Israel is a strategic partner to the United States, and its survival and its prosperity and security is relevant to American national security, you would come here, the Golan. For decades, this was one of the more peaceful parts of the border that Israel has to police. Not so much now. So I've got a simple message. I will go back to the United States Senate, working with Senator Cruz. I will start an effort to recognize the Golan as part of the state of Israel now and forever, because to give this territory up would be a strategic nightmare for the state of Israel. And who would you give it to?
Don't you think we'd like to see some British politicians speaking like Senator Lindsay there about how important it is for Israel's security and how much it's a shared value between Israel and Britain, that Israel should actually maintain its control of the Golan Heights. And one thing the British government could do is follow in the United States' footsteps and recognise Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And the big question there posed by Senator Lindsay, wasn't it, was who could you possibly give the land to, knowing that the state that Syria is in after facing a civil war since 2011, the presence of 80,000 Iranian troops and militia under its control, the presence of Russian troops in Syria, and that's not forgetting to mention kind of the presence of ISIS in Syria as well. Yes. And who would possibly want that mix on their doorstep?
Yeah. Nobody in their right mind would want that mix on their doorstep. And this is the reality of what Israel has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. This is who is on their doorstep. And you extend that round to the north, and you've got Hezbollah with all the literally tens of thousands of rockets embedded on the northern border. We've had the whole situation of tunnels dug under the Lebanese border, which I remember when I was living and working in Israel for those 2 years, they said it was impossible to dig tunnels under the Lebanese border. And yet here we are 2-3 years later, and they found them and had to block them up and destroy them. So, Israel on a day-to-day basis has to deal with the potential for its destruction. And I can't think of any other nation state on planet Earth that has to live with that reality and deal with that reality in every sense, emotionally, financially, psychologically, militarily. This is what Israel has to deal with. And the Golan is a prime example of the dangers that Israel and the Jewish people and all of the rest of the inhabitants of the land of Israel have to face on a day-to-day basis. And therefore, it is incumbent upon any Israeli government to give some sort of priority to maintaining its presence up in an area which, if it gave it away, would be a platform for destruction.
Absolutely. And also what's so important as well, that in a recent survey in Israel, that 60% of the Israelis questioned said that they opposed Israel so-called returning the Golan Heights in any negotiations with Syria. And just imagine what the Golan Heights would look like now had the Israelis actually given in to American pressure, international pressure to concede that territory, for what would only be an incredibly false peace with Syria. The fact is that you'd have Iranian presence of troops up on the Golan Heights. Hezbollah and Israel has only recently, over the last couple of months, found Hezbollah sleeper cell on that border in the Golan Heights, that area of no man's land between Israel and Syria, and trying to recruit Hezbollah forces there and the population to fight for Hezbollah, to do reconnaissance, to load very dangerous missiles that are capable of hitting Israel. And we've seen also in last couple of years attacks on the Golan Heights by Syrian missiles as well. So we know that would have been an absolute nightmare for Israel's security had Israel in the 90s entered into peace negotiations with President Assad and given the Golan Heights to the Syrian regime.
Yeah. I mean, the polling that I've read in relation to the recent national election indicates that a lot of this shifting in the attitude in Israel towards not giving away land for peace, which was the big sort of mantra back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s, has shifted because the younger generation, those born in the land, have seen the disaster that giving away the Gaza Strip was and still is. So a higher percentage of the population has learned the bitter lesson of the Gaza debacle, and it actually then is supporting the government of the day in not making the same mistake with the Golan Heights, and also, we don't have time to discuss it today, but also not making the same mistake with the disputed territories, the so-called West Bank. So Israeli politics is in flux, it's shifting, and more of the population has cottoned onto the idea that land for peace doesn't work, especially with enemies that are so entrenched in an ideological point of view that they only see death and destruction as the only way of solving their problems.
Absolutely. So let's look at this video now by someone who's been classified as an Israeli cowboy who is actually living upon the Golan Heights.
High in the Golan Heights, a cattle drive is underway, steered by a team of Israeli cowboys. Israel's remote northernmost region offers the most fertile soil in the country, ideal for farming and raising cattle. Young men come here with dreams of carving out a life for themselves through working the land. Men like Jonathan Rosenberg.
My connection to the land, for me as a Jewish person, it's sort of a homing beacon. First time I came out here, all the things that I learned in the Torah, it all clicked together. I came to Israel my first time when I was 19 to go find myself per se, and also find out, all about the land. Always wanting to go to the army, but wanted my mom's grace to go. Until 25, I was back and forth to Israel, America, until my mom gave the okay to go. I came out 26, joined up. A real big thing that got me in defending the Jewish nation was we have less people than most armies, but because of people's love for this nation, they fight with such more passion. We're not going out on the offensive to go and attack other people. If we get attacked, we're going out. So I always wanted to be part of that because, it's defending the place I love, the people I love. So now I feel that I've done my portion in defending this generation, and my kids will also be the defenders in the next generation, God willing. I think I was able to be part of it and continue to be part of it. So now that I've gotten out of the IDF, My plan is to bring cattle from the States, build up a farm, get married out here so that my family can continue and help out this nation. In the long shot, build a community and have even more families that have the same dreams or the same calling from God. There's definitely something happening. Everybody's feeling it, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the States. People my age, the younger kids, especially a lot of kids in college are getting a lot of, hate. There's a lot of anti-Israel in it. It's definitely breeding a new love and a new calling for people to come to Israel. There's been an abundance of people from places where they felt comfortable to come out to start a new life out here. There's something out there. There's something in the air that's changed. It's definitely having a big effect on kids coming and wanting to join the IDF or coming to live in Israel itself and, get her done. Israel is, to me, my everything, my dream, my hope, my future, my family's future. And God willing, all that will come true the way it should be and the way it will be. I am Jonathan Rosenberg, and I am Israel.
And I didn't know if there was anything known as an Israeli cowboy. Now we all know there is such a thing as Israeli cowboys. I thought that clip was brilliant because it brought the kind of personal human story to the Golan Heights. And literally, the Golan Heights is one of my favourite parts of Israel. And if you ever visit Israel, and I hope you do, go to the Golan because it's absolutely spectacular. In terms of international law, prior to the programme, just did a bit of research, and this was a publication put out by the Jerusalem Centre for Public Affairs, and an article written by Ambassador Alan Baker. He says this: despite these elements within the international community that reject the US proclamation and claim that it's incompatible with international legal norms, the case of the Golan Heights points to a unique situation. An aggressor state that loses its territory after an offensive war and constantly refuses all efforts to make peace for over half a century cannot expect to maintain a bona fide right to claim back the territory. The power of the controlling the territory becomes entitled to a better claim and entitled to the territory. So that's the kind of legal position on this one. What do you make of it?
Well, you also have men like Alan Dershowitz, who's well known, in international legal circles. You have another international legal scholar, Eugene Kontorovich, and both of these are challenging the often trotted out statements from the UN, from EU, from British politicians that this is all illegal. And as this quote that you've just read out makes clear, this was territory gained as a result of a defensive war. And as far as the UN sort of charter and the legal treaties that are attached to it, there's nothing wrong with that. So for the UN then to come back and say the exact opposite, you think, okay, so you're actually undermining some of the foundations of for the reason that this organization was set up in the first place. And then you have the whole situation, and we were talking about it briefly before the program started, that as far as the EU is concerned, that post the Yom Kippur War in '73, the EEC, as it was at that point, made an agreement with the Arab League. And there's a whole sort of slew of conditions, but basically the major condition is that the European Union will never rescind its push towards a two-state solution with East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state and all the ramifications that go around that. So the EU is never going to recognize Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, its sovereignty over the Golan Heights, its sovereignty over at least part of the so-called West Bank, the disputed territories, because they have signed up to an agreement with the Arab League to plow that particular furrow. Now, I know, you know, that there are one or two Eastern European states that are bucking that trend, but generally old Europe has fallen into line, and we're now part of that at the moment, you know, pursuing this course of diplomacy and action. And that's why we have this intransigence on the part of our government in failing to come into line behind the United States on some of these major international decisions. Yep. Because we're tied into a legal agreement between the European Union and the Arab League.
Two very important questions I want to discuss before we close this programme, Robin. And the first one is the kind of Arab reaction to President Trump's announcement of recognising Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights as being pretty quiet. And that does reflect the strategic realities that we're seeing now in the region. And the fact is that the Sunni Arab states don't mind so much because they're more concerned about the presence of Iranian troops and the Shia Crescent in the Middle East than they are about Israel maintaining control over the Golan. What are your thoughts?
Yes, you're right. And if you read some of the commentary that's going on at the present time, the Sunni states are getting more and more disenchanted with the so-called Palestinian cause, to the point that they're saying to the Palestinians, look, sort this out because we're not going to support you anymore. And so again, that's why there's been less noise about the Golan. There wasn't really that much noise about Jerusalem, because they're fed up with the corruption, with the human rights abuses that are going on inside Gaza, the Palestinian territories, that actually are giving the Arab cause a bad name. So the Palestinians are actually losing support of their own people, you know, in this whole ongoing conflict and tension.
Yeah. And the other issue I want to discuss, which I think is a very important one, is what President Trump gets out of this, because clearly it was a political gift to the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and gave him a huge edge in the Israeli elections, which enabled him to win those Israeli elections. And also, we've seen pretty much with the move of the Democrats to the left, and in particular the recent AIPAC conference in Washington, D.C., which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, in which they have a conference, a bipartisan political conference with Democrats and Republicans showing their mutual support for Israel. This year, the Democrat senators and congressmen, many of them failed to turn up because they don't want to side with Israel and the current political climate in the United States. And surely this was also a gift to Netanyahu to boost his re-election, but also another means of attacking the Democrats by saying, President Trump is now the party of the Jewish people and now the party that backs Israel, and Democrats have turned their back on this one, so there's political advantages he can have for the forthcoming presidential elections next year.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump and his advisors are not daft. You know, they are playing to a particular constituency within the American electorate. But I honestly believe that President Trump means well, and you know, he's taking the advice of those who are around him, who are, you know, speaking to him, and is doing his best to support Israel and the Jewish state. But the one caveat in all of that is, you know, again, we were talking about this before we started recording. We don't know what's coming in this so-called deal of the century, peace deal, and whether, you know, I've given you this, I've given you Jerusalem, yes, I've given you the Golan Heights, now you need to give me, on behalf of the Palestinians, something in return, and we have yet to see what that's going to be.
And that's another programme in itself, Robin. So, Robin, it's great to have you back, and I'm so pleased that you're back and healthy and able to be on the Middle East Report. So wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity to come and spend this time with you, Simon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Robin. And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. We discussed today the importance and the strategic significance of the Golan Heights to Israel. And, you know, we salute you, President Trump, for what you've done. We call upon this nation, and particularly the British government, to recognise Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights because of our shared values. Now, if the Americans think that Israel is important to US security, well, also Israel is important to British security. Therefore, the British government has to recognise Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and actually follow in line with the United States so that they are on the right side of history. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.